Hello, my name is Trace. I'm from the state of Kansas, within the United States. I would like to introduce to you this channel consisting of English with a subtitle.
The Storybook of Science by JEAN-HENRI FABRE, 1823 to 1915. Chapter 6. The Clever Dervish. Anthills are everywhere, large and small, Jules remarked. Even in the garden I could count a dozen. Some of them have so many ants that they blacken the road when they come out. It must take a lot of plant lice to feed that many ants. Though there are many ants, his uncle replied, they will never run out of food, because plant lice are even more abundant. There are so many that they can seriously threaten our crops. The miserable plant louse is a real enemy to us. To understand, listen to the story. Once there was a king of India who was bored. To entertain him, a dervish invented the game of chess. You don't know this game? Well, it's played on a board like a checkerboard, with two sides, one white and one black, each with pieces of different values, pawns, knights, bishops, castles, queen, and king. The game starts. The pawns, symbol soldiers, are always the first to fight. The king watches from a safe distance, far from the action. Then the knights charge, slashing their swords, when the bishops join in with great enthusiasm, and the castles move around, protecting the army. Eventually, the game is decided. The Black Queen is captured, the king loses his castles, and one knight and one bishop do their best to help him escape. They fail. The king is checkmated. The game is lost. This clever game, which mirrors war, pleased the king so much that he asked the dervish what reward he wanted for inventing it. Light of the faithful, replied the dervish. A poor dervish is easily satisfied. You can give me 1 grain of wheat for the first square of the chessboard, 2 for the second, 4 for the third, 8 for the fourth, and double the grains for each square until they reach the 64th square. That will be enough for me. My pigeons will have plenty of food. This man is a fool, thought the king. He could have asked for riches, but instead he wants a few handfuls of wheat. Then, turning to his minister, he said, give him 10 purses of 1,000 sequins each, and a sack of wheat. That will be 100 times more grain than he's asking for. Commander of the faithful, the dervish answered, keep your sequins, which are useless to my pigeons, and give me the wheat as I requested. Very well. Instead of 1 sack, you shall have 100. That's not enough, son of justice. You shall have 1,000. Not enough, terror of the unfaithful. The squares of my chessboard will not have the proper amount. The courtiers whispered among themselves, amazed by the dervish's strange request. Frustrated, the king called in his mathematicians to calculate the grains of wheat he needed. The dervish smiled and waited patiently for the result. As the calculation went on, the number grew larger and larger. When it was finished, one of the mathematicians spoke up. Sublime commander, he said, arithmetic has spoken. To meet the dervish's request, there isn't enough wheat in your granaries, in the town, in the kingdom, or anywhere on earth. The amount of grain needed would cover the entire world, land and sea, to the depth of 1 finger. The king angrily bit his mustache, unable to meet the dervish's demand. So he made the inventor of chess the prime vizier. That was exactly what the clever dervish had wanted. Like the king, I would have fallen into the dervish's trap, said Jules. I would have thought that doubling a grain of wheat 64 times would only result in a few handfuls. From now on, said Uncle Paul, you'll know that even a small number, when doubled many times, grows like a snowball rolling downhill, becoming so large that no one can move it. The dervish was very clever, said Emile. He asked for just 1 grain of wheat for his pigeons, but with the condition that it doubled on each square. At first, it seemed like nothing, but in reality, it was more than the king could give. By the way, what is a dervish, Uncle? In Eastern religions, a dervish is someone who renounces worldly pleasures to focus on prayer and meditation. So the king made him prime vizier. Is that a high rank? Prime vizier means prime minister. The dervish became the highest official in the land after the king. Now I understand why he turned down 10 purses of sequins. But the 10 purses would have been quite a sum, right? A sequin is a gold coin worth about 12 francs. So the king offered the dervish 120,000 francs plus the sacks of wheat, and the dervish preferred the wheat doubled 64 times. That's right. Compared to that, what the king offered him was nothing. And the plant lice? Asked Jules. The story of the dervish brings us to the plant lice, his uncle replied. Chapter 7. A Large Family. Let's assume, Uncle Ball continued, that a single aphid has just settled on a tender shoot of a rose bush. It's alone, all alone. A few days later, more aphids surround it. They are its offspring. How many are there? 10? 20? 100? Let's say 10. Is that enough to ensure the survival of the species? Don't laugh at my question. I know that if aphids disappeared from the rose bushes, the world wouldn't change much. The ants would be the ones that suffer, said Emile. The earth would keep on spinning just the same, even if the last aphid were to die on its leaf. But it's still not an insignificant question to ask if 10 aphids are enough to sustain the species. After all, science's greatest goal is to find the right balance in nature, keeping everything in harmony and prosperity. Well, 10 aphids from one would be too many if we didn't have to consider the destructive forces. One replacing one keeps the population steady. 10 replacing one would quickly cause the number to grow beyond control. Think of the dervish's grain of wheat. Doubles 64 times until it covers the earth in a bed of wheat a finger deep. What would happen if it had multiplied tenfold instead of doubling? In the same way, after a few years, the descendants of a single aphid, growing 10 times more each generation, would face overcrowding. But then, death, the great reaper, acts as a natural check. It balances life's overwhelming growth, ensuring that everything stays in constant renewal. Even on a seemingly peaceful rosebush, death is happening constantly. The small, humble, and weak often provide food for the larger, stronger creatures. The aphid, tiny and defenseless, faces countless dangers. As soon as a young bird, barely out of the nest, spots a cluster of aphids, it will eagerly eat hundreds in a single sitting. And if a more voracious creature, a terrible worm created for no other purpose than to devour them, joins in, the aphids are in real trouble. This devourer is a delicate green with a white stripe on its back, tapering at the front and swollen in the back. When it curls up, it forms a teardrop shape. It's known as the lion ant because of the damage it causes to the aphid herd. It hides among them and, with its pointed mouth, grabs the largest, fattest one. It sucks it dry and then discards the skin, which is too tough to digest. It repeats this, attacking aphid after aphid, 10, 20, even 100. The rest of the aphids, oblivious to this danger, continue feeding peacefully as if nothing were wrong. They eat while they wait to be eaten. The ant lion has had enough and takes a moment to rest, digesting its meal. But once digestion is complete, it's already eyeing its next victim. After weeks of constant feeding, having devoured entire colonies of aphids, the worm finally transforms into a sleek dragonfly, its golden eyes shining brightly, known as the Haemorubius. Is that all? Oh, not at all. Look at the ladybug, often called the good God's bug. It's round, red, and dotted with black spots. A truly charming little creature with an innocent air. But don't be fooled. Beneath that pleasant exterior lies a voracious predator. It devours plant lice with relentless appetite. If you observe it closely on a rose bush, you'll catch it feasting ferociously. It's undeniably adorable, but it's also a glutton. There's no denying its love for plant lice. And that's not all. Those poor plant lice are a feast for countless other creatures. Young birds dine on them, lacewing larvae devour them, and ladybugs feast on them. Despite this, plant lice are everywhere, thriving in staggering numbers. This is nature's way, a battle between life's abundance and its constant struggles. The weak survive by sheer numbers, sacrificing millions to ensure a few endure. The herring, cod, and sardine face similar odds in the seas. These fish are preyed upon by countless predators from the ocean depths, the skies above, and the shores they swim near. Even humans join in the hunt, sending fleets to haul them in. Yet, despite this relentless consumption, their numbers hardly dwindle. Why? Because the weak are incredibly prolific. Consider this. A single cod can lay 9 million eggs. Who could possibly devour all that offspring? 9 million eggs, Emil exclaimed. That's a lot. Indeed, Uncle Paul replied. To count them all, one by one, would take nearly a year, working 10 hours a day. Whoever counted them must have had a lot of patience, Emil said. They don't count them by hand, Uncle Paul explained with a smile. They weigh them and calculate the number from that. Plant lice, like the cod, face endless dangers but have their own strategies for survival. Instead of laying eggs, which take time to hatch, they give birth to live young. These offspring mature in just 2 weeks and start producing the next generation. This cycle repeats throughout the season, at least half the year. Each plant louse must produce 10 more, and those 10 each produce another 10, and so on. By the 12th generation, the number explodes to 100,000 million. To count all the descendants of one plant louse over 6 months would take 10,000 years. Guess how much space these plant lice would cover if packed as tightly as they are on a branch, Uncle Paul asked. Maybe the size of our garden, Claire ventured. Far more than that, Uncle Paul replied. Our garden is about 100 meters long and wide. The descendants of a single plant louse would cover 10 times that area. 10 hectares. Can you imagine that? It's a good thing creatures like birds, ladybugs, and dragonflies work hard to keep them in check. Without them, these little pests could take over the world. Even so, plant lice remain a serious threat. Swarms of them have been known to darken the skies, traveling from one region to another and devastating crops. When this happens, it's not raging storms or natural disasters that test humanity. It's these tiny, seemingly insignificant creatures. Despite their size, their overwhelming numbers can bring mankind to its knees, threatening the very food we depend upon. Uncle Paul concluded his lesson about plant lice and their predators. Emil, Jules, and Claire often talked about the mind-boggling numbers involved, marveling at nature's power. They agreed Uncle Paul's story were far more fascinating than any of Mother Abuzine's old tales. Chapter 8. The Old Pear Tree. Uncle Paul had just cut down a pear tree in the garden. The tree was old, its trunk eaten away by worms, and it hadn't produced any fruit for years. It was time to replace it with a new one. The children found Uncle Paul sitting on the fallen trunk, looking closely at something. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, he muttered, tapping his finger on the cross-section of the cut tree. What was he counting? Come quickly, he called to the children. The pear tree has a story to tell you. It seems to have something interesting to share." The children laughed. "And what could the old pear tree possibly tell us?" asked Jules, curious. "Take a look here," said Uncle Paul, pointing to the freshly cut surface. "I made sure that the cut was nice and clean with an axe. Do you see the rings in the wood? They start in the middle and grow bigger and bigger as they spread outward, all the way to the bark." "I see them," replied Jules. "They look like rings inside each other." "It's a bit like the ripples on water after throwing a stone," added Claire. "I see them too, if I look closely," chimed in Emile. "Well," Uncle Paul continued, "those circles are called annual rings. Do you know why they're called that? It's because each represents a year. Just one ring per year, no more and no less." Botanists, the scientists who study plants, have confirmed this without any doubt. From the moment a tree sprouts as a seedling to the day it dies, it adds one new ring every year. Now, let's count the rings on our pear tree. Uncle Paul used a pin to keep track as he counted. Emile, Jules, and Claire watched closely. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They counted all the way to 45 from the center of the trunk to the outer edge. "This trunk has 45 rings," Uncle Paul announced. "Can anyone tell me what that means? How old is a pear tree?" "That's easy," Jules replied. "Since it forms one ring every year and we've counted 45, the pear tree must be 45 years old." "Exactly," Uncle Paul said with a smile. "Didn't I tell you the pear tree would share its story? It told us its age, 45 years. "How fascinating," Jules exclaimed. "You can figure out a tree's age just by counting its rings. It's like you were there when it sprouted." "Uncle, do all trees, like oaks, beeches, and chestnuts, work the same way?" "Exactly the same," Uncle Paul confirmed. "Count the rings and you'll know its age." "Oh, I wish I'd known that the other day," Emile said. "They cut down the big beech tree by the roadside. What a magnificent tree! Its branches covered a whole field. I bet it was really old." "Not as old as you might think," said Uncle Paul. "I counted its rings. It had 170. 170 rings!" Emily gasped. "Really?" "Really and truly, my little friend," Uncle Paul replied. "The beech tree was 170 years old." "That's incredible," said Jules. "A tree can live that long?" "And it probably would have kept growing for many more years if the road mender hadn't cut it down to widen the road. For us humans, 170 years would be an impossible age," Uncle Paul said. "But for a tree, it's not much at all. Let's sit in the shade. I've got more to tell you about the incredible lifespans of trees." Chapter 9. The Age of Trees. People once told stories of a chestnut tree in Sancerre with a trunk over 4 meters in circumference. By conservative estimates, it was 300 to 400 years old. But don't be surprised by the age of this tree. This is just the beginning of the story. There are even larger chestnuts, like the one near Lake Geneva and another in Montom-le-Mar. The first has a trunk 13 meters around, and back in 1408, it was already big enough to shelter a hermitage. Over the centuries, it's been struck by lightning multiple times, but it's still thriving, full of leaves and producing fruit. The second tree, the majestic, is now a ruin. Its once high branches are bare, and its trunk, measuring 11 meters around, is marked by deep crevices, the wrinkles of old age. Estimating the age of these two giants is nearly impossible, but it could be around 1,000 years. Even so, both trees continue to bear fruit, showing no signs of dying. 1,000 years? If Uncle hadn't said it, I wouldn't believe it, Jules blurted out. "Shh, listen to the rest of the story," his uncle replied. "The largest chestnut tree in the world is on the slopes of Mount Etna in Sicily. Look at the map. Sicily is a triangular island near the toe of Italy's boot. Mount Etna, a famous volcano, rises there. The tree is called the Chestnut of 100 Horses, named after Queen Joan of Aragon, who took refuge under its canopy with her escort of 100 horsemen during a storm. Its trunk is over 50 meters round, so massive that it's more like a fortress than a tree. At its base is a hollow large enough for 2 carriages to pass through side by side. Despite its age and size, the ancient tree still produces chestnuts. The uncle continued. Neustadt in Württemberg is home to an ancient linden tree whose branches, too heavy with age, are supported by 100 stone pillars. Its canopy spans 130 meters in circumference. Even in 1229, this tree was called the Big Linden. It must be at least 700 to 800 years old now. In France, there was an even older linden tree at the Château de Chalais. In 1804, its trunk measured 15 meters in circumference, with 6 large branches propped up by numerous supports. If it's still standing, it must be over 1,100 years old. In Normandy, the cemetery of Alleville is home to one of France's oldest oaks. Its trunk, 10 meters around, is partly hollow and has been transformed into a chapel dedicated to Our Lady of Peace. The ancient oak, nearly 900 years old, continues to thrive. Some trees are even older. In 1824, a woodcutter in the Ardennes felled an oak that had stood for 1,500 or 1,600 years. In cemeteries, where trees are protected from harm, some have reached incredible ages. 2 yews in the Haie de Rodot cemetery, despite damage from storms, still stand tall. Their trunks, each 9 meters around, are thought to be 1,400 years old. But even they pale in comparison to the yews in Scotland. One measured 29 meters in circumference and was believed to be 2,500 years old. Another, famous in 1660, was said to be over 2,824 years old. If it still exists, it's now over 3,000 years old, the elder of European trees. After a pause, Uncle Paul added, "There are even older trees in foreign lands, some almost as ancient as the world itself." Chapter 10. The Length of Animal Life. Jules and Claire were amazed by their uncle's story about ancient trees, which seemed to view centuries as mere days compared to us. Emile, as restless as ever, shifted the conversation to a different topic. "What about animals, Uncle?" he asked. "How long do they live?" "Well," their uncle began, "domestic animals rarely reach the ages they're capable of. We overwork them, underfeed them, and fail to provide proper shelter. On top of that, we take everything from them, their milk, wool, hide, and even their lives. How can they grow old when the butcher waits with his knife at the stable door? But let's set aside those poor creatures and imagine an animal treated well fed, warm, free from fear or exhaustion. Under those conditions, how long might it live? Let's start with an ox. It's a powerful animal, isn't it? Look at that broad chest, those muscular shoulders, and the strong, square forehead with those sturdy horns. Its serene eyes radiate strength. If long life were tied to strength, you'd think the ox would live for centuries." "I think so too," Jules agreed. "But you'd be wrong, my dear children. Despite its size and strength, an ox is considered old at 20 or 30 years. What would be youthful for us is ancient for it. Now, take a horse. Like the ox, it's strong and robust. And don't forget its humble companion, the donkey. Yet neither of them typically live beyond 30 or 35 years. Jules gasped. "I had no idea. I thought the horse and the ox would live at least a century. They're so big and impressive." His uncle smiled. "Ah, Jules, taking up space in the world doesn't guarantee a long life." He paused before returning to the topic. "Now, about our other domestic animals. their lifespans are even shorter. A dog might reach 20 or 25 years, but by then is barely able to move. Pigs are elderly at 20. Cats, by 15, have retired from chasing mice and seek a quiet corner to rest. Goats and sheep are old at 10 to 15. Rabbits at 8 to 10. The rat rarely lives beyond 4 years. What about birds? Claire asked. Well, pigeons can live 6 to 10 years, while guinea fowl, hens, and turkeys can live up to 12. Geese, however, live much longer, up to 25 years or more, likely because they're such carefree creatures. Even so, small songbirds like goldfinches and sparrows, which are full of life and joy, often match or outlive geese, reaching 20 to 25 years. It just goes to show that size doesn't determine lifespan. And humans? Jules asked. Humans, when they lead healthy lives, often live to 80 or 90. Some even surpass 100. The average lifespan, though, is closer to 40, which, compared to most animals, is quite long. But remember, life isn't just measured by the number of years. A meaningful life is what you accomplish and the good you do. When the time comes to leave this world, it's not our age that matters, but the respect we've earned and the duties we've fulfilled. In that sense, no matter how long we've lived, we'll have lived enough.